Hey everyone, welcome to installment number 2 of our new C group series on evangelism based on Styles' book, Evangelism. And in case you missed it, on the last episode, we wrapped up Case for Christ a couple of weeks ago now, and we picked up a new book, this time not on apologetics specifically, but more directly on evangelism. And the book is entitled Evangelism, and it's by Mark Styles. And so we're going to be going through that. And just to kick us off before we jump into chapter 2, I'd like to do a quick recap of what we covered in chapter 1. So, chapter 1 was all about getting some basic definitions in order before we moved on to really talk about evangelism in more practical detail. And so, first off, Stiles wanted us to define what evangelism is. And he offered this definition. Evangelism, according to Stiles, is teaching the gospel with an aim to persuade. So it's teaching people what the gospel is in a way where we're trying to get them to believe it. And then we saw another definition that we could use is the gospel is attempting to guide someone into God's kingdom. And on that definition, really anything we do with the aim of helping someone who's outside the kingdom come into the kingdom counts as evangelism. And then second question we looked at is, what is the gospel? So if evangelism is all about this thing called the gospel, what is it? And we saw that the gospel is really at its core this message that God is willing to be reconciled with us now. And to unpack that, we saw that you could kind of explain the full content of the gospel to someone by answering 4 questions. Who is God? Who are we? What has God done? And what can we do in response? So that's all the recap I'll give you. I would encourage you, if you missed it, to just head on over to either the YouTube channel, which I assume you're on if you are currently watching this video, and check out the video, or go over to the NAOBC Youth Live homepage, click on the Take Home Materials little tab or banner there, and you'll see some C group reflection sheets. And if you get the one for last week's lesson, that will have a quick recap of the lesson and also some helpful additional material. So anyways, that was last week. That was chapter 1. Now we're on to this week and chapter 2. And in chapter 2, Stiles focuses on creating a culture of evangelism. And I want us to unpack this lesson or this chapter with 3 questions. Number 1 is, what does it mean to have a culture of evangelism? Number 2, why is a culture of evangelism important? And then number 3, how can we start to develop a culture of evangelism or to continue to develop a culture of evangelism? So let's jump in to that first question. What does it mean to have a culture of evangelism? Well, let's think about the word culture for a second. To have a culture of something just means that there's a group of people that regularly does a particular thing. So sometimes you might hear people talk about American culture versus French culture or Mexican culture. And really, all that means is, what are some things that Americans do regularly? So we might say that Christmas is part of American culture. Why? Because we do it every year. Or we might say that fast food is part of American culture. Why? Because we eat it all the time. In the same way, sometimes you can think about how families have unique cultures inside of them. So, for instance, in the Smith household, we make up a lot of songs. They're not particularly good, usually relate oddly specifically to what we're doing right in that exact moment, but we make up a lot of songs. That's just part of the Smith family culture right here. And that's all it means to have a culture. And typically, any group of people has some kind of culture, some things, some patterns that they do on a regular basis, and churches are no different. So when we talk about a church having a culture of evangelism, all we mean is the people in the church regularly do evangelism. So that's what a culture of evangelism is. Now, second, let's think about why is having a culture of evangelism so important? And here I think there's at least two reasons we can give. One's kind of a lesser reason and one's a bigger reason. So let's start with the lesser reason. The lesser reason is this. Usually, when people join a group, so when you join a friend group or you join a club or you go to a new church or a new school, typically people who join groups start to get on board with the culture. They start to do the things that everybody else in the group does on a regular basis. So when you have a culture of evangelism at a church, when evangelism is just something people do on a regular basis, that normally means that when people join that church, it's going to become something they start to do on a regular basis. And so that's one reason to have a culture of evangelism. The second and bigger reason is because the Bible calls us to have a culture of evangelism, to do evangelism as just part of our DNA. And I want us to look at two passages that talk about this. Number one is Luke 10, verse 1. And we read this. This is right in the middle of Jesus's earthly ministry. And we read this. And this, after this, the Lord appointed 72 others, that in addition to the apostles, and he sent them ahead of him in pairs to every town and place where he himself was about to go. So even during the ministry of Jesus, Jesus was pairing people off and having them regularly go out on what we can think of as kind of proto-evangelistic outreaches, which is these were like really early evangelistic efforts of the church. But Jesus, even in his ministry, was teaching his disciples that they were to regularly be about doing evangelism and doing it together. Notice he didn't send them off one by one, but he sent them off two by two. The second passage I want us to look at is Acts chapter 2, verses 46 and 47, which says this. Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple and broke bread from house to house. They ate their food with joyful and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. Every day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. So here, Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, is describing what the very earliest church looked like. This was the church right after Jesus had ascended back into heaven. This was the church under the leadership of the apostles. And I think it's meant to be for us a picture of what the church looks like when it's functioning well. And notice what happens. The church doesn't have a special missions program. They don't have like a special event they're throwing. Instead, the church does evangelism as just part of who they are, part of their regular weekly habits of listening to the teaching of the apostles, gathering together for fellowship and being in each other's houses and being out in the community. That's when they were doing evangelism, just living their lives in their weekly routine, and it resulted in people joining the church. So, putting those two together, I think we see that evangelism, having a culture of evangelism, is important because when you have a culture of evangelism, it helps people who are a part of your church to grow in evangelism. We tend to build off each other that way. And second, the Bible doesn't depict evangelism as something that just a few people in the church do. It depicts evangelism as something that everybody in the church is meant to be a part of. So that takes us to our third question, which is how can we start to develop a culture of evangelism? And I think we can think of that both as developing a culture at Ninth and O, but also developing a culture within our own youth ministry. And here's a few ideas. Number one, find a partner. Notice that when Jesus sent his followers out, he didn't send them one by one, he sent them out two by two. And this, for me, was one of the most helpful thoughts Stiles had in this chapter, that doing evangelism well doesn't mean doing it by ourselves. It means finding a partner to go out and reach the lost together with. And so I would encourage you that whether it's in your neighborhood or part of some club or team that you're a member of, or at your school, if possible, find another brother or sister in Christ and commit to partnering together to just love on and reach the lost where you're at with the gospel. Number two is focus on just one person. Last year we used this language of having your one at Ninth and O as part of our mission. And I think it's helpful that instead of trying to reach everybody everywhere you go, to just focus on one person who's lost, and really drive your efforts towards that one person. Number three is intercede, invest, invite. Dr. Cook has been using this as a part of Ninth and O's culture for years, that a great way to begin reaching the lost is to intercede, to pray for them, invest, to build a relationship with them, and then simply to invite them into the church. And I'd encourage you that once you have your partner, once you have your one picked out, to begin the process of interceding, investing, and inviting for them. And then the last one is tell stories. What gets other people excited about evangelism? What helps us build a culture of evangelism is when we are telling genuine stories about how evangelism is being lived out in our lives among one another. So I would encourage you that when you do start to evangelize, don't feel ashamed or hesitant to bring up in the company of your brothers and sisters in a humble way the stories of what God is doing in your life in that area. All right, thank you guys for checking out another NAWC Youth Live C Group lesson. Really looking forward to seeing those of you who can make it in one of our online hangouts. Take care.